Hey everybody, obviously we recorded this before everything went crazy, so there's no talk of Corona in this episode, but hopefully everyone out there is doing okay, and we will just figure this out as we go. I'm teleworking for a little while, so hopefully episodes will come out with a little bit more frequency, and if you have anything you want us to know about or any stories you think we should cover, please don't hesitate to send them in, PaleoPOWs at ScienceSortative.com. All right, enjoy the episode.
From ScienceSortative.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of. You're listening to episode 318, where our theme is the X-Men Files, a Star Wars story, which will make sense in a moment. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science is, again, returning guest, Asher Elbein. We spent a little bit more time after talking about some of the science reporting he's done, just kind of nerding out, just being geeks, just dorking around. I don't know. That just went into a weird space. Listen, we talked about X-Men and Star Wars and other nerd stuff, and here's the first part. All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and push right past literally half the topics we had talked about discussing, and we will just have to have you back on again, which I'm not upset about at all. And instead, I'm just gonna go right into let's talk about comic books.
Sure.
Let's talk about sequential words and pictures. The Scott McCloud definition.
Love those comic books. Comics are good, actually.
They tell a story. You got to look at the gut. Look what's happening in the gutters.
And this is where I have to at least shout out the passing of Tom Spurgeon, who is really the great sort of like comics writer of our time. This is going to sound sarcastic, but I mean it 100% sincerely. Hats off to a real one. Like, he was very good, and he will be very, very deeply missed. Especially considering there was a time where I was being paid every week to write about comics, and never in my most proud moments would I have considered myself a comics journalist, because I'm not sure that comics journalism is really a thing. But it's not well paid enough to be a thing, unfortunately.
I'm also not sure there's a need. But he was as close to being transcendent in that form, I think, as one could be.
Yes, very much.
His stuff was incredibly literate and thoughtful, and we were joking earlier about how science journalism is often just repeating the press release. Well, if you think science journalism is just about repeating the press release,
oh boy,
let me introduce you to comics journalism.
Yeah, pour one out for Comics Alliance, the only real comics journal site.
The website I wrote for was iFanboy. And I still go on their podcast regularly, and I don't think iFanboy would have ever claimed they were doing journalism. So it's not even an insult to say that Comics Alliance was the only one out there, because iFanboy was always about commentary and culture. So yeah.
But so comics. What am I reading? What
are you enjoying? Talk comics.
Yeah. Honestly, I've been thinking a lot about X-Men. Did you read?
Okay, so you're on that horse now.
I am. Yeah. Well, so I used to not have any particularly strong feelings about X-Men one way or another. That was going
to be my next question. Was were you ever an X-Men guy? Because that's a particular type of comics fan, and a guy in a non-gendered way.
Yeah. No. Yeah. An X person, if you will.
It's almost as if that comic would have something to say about that distinction.
You would think it would, except they're not really brave enough to dive into sort of like gender fluidity, alas. Although I would absolutely read that X comic.
There was an amazing discussion on iFanboy one time of whether could Mystique as a male get someone pregnant.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that if it were ever to come up in actual X comics, I would want to see handled very carefully.
Right. I mean, but I feel like your idea of it would be a cool idea if handled carefully is going to be juxtaposed by that's the thing that could bring back the Comics Code Authority, so they're never going to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, that's true. But I think so per like my relationship with X-Men was, I saw like a couple of movies and liked them. I read the Grant Morrison run. I read there was a period when I was younger where I read a bunch of the big like Chris Claremont, classic black and white hardcovers. I know who they are. And, I listened to the podcast Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, wherein two wonderful and friendly nerds go through the entire history of X-Men, retcons and all, and explain the incredibly convoluted continuity, which is a lot of fun.
Have you been reading Grand Design?
I did read Grand Design. I sort of what Grand Design is, for those who don't know, God, who writes that book? Do you remember?
He writes and draws it, and he's great. He did Hip Hop Family Tree.
What's his name?
I follow him on Twitter, but he never tweets, so I don't see his name very often.
Yeah. So, but what it is it's this
Pisker.
it's this attempt to what is it?
Ed Pisker.
Oh, it is Ed Pisker. Okay, I was thinking that, but I was like, that's not right. But yeah, what he does is it's an attempt to sort of
streamline. Like he's just
knit together and streamline however many years of these sort of divergent X-Men comics into a single unified story, which is an act of madness, but is pretty good. But so the reason I'm back on that X-Men is because so Marvel creator Johnathan Hickman came out with this sort of pair of dual interweaving miniseries, which are actually just one series, but it's one of these comics things where it's like they split them up into separate series because that way they can get more of your money. But it completely reinvents the X-Men. It completely reinvents a lot of the sort of like metaphorical ideas. It's an absolute barn burner of a structural experiment. The art is gorgeous, and it is the first time in, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 years when the X-Men comics have had a new idea. And so it was very strange for me to be, not only just reading these X books and enjoying, the adventures of, Cyclops and Jean Grey and Wolverine and all these other folks, but also have it be wedded to this really big, ambitious sci-fi story about time loops and sort of like giant
time loops and cosmic consciousness.
Oh yeah, time loops, cosmic consciousness. It's a very funny book. Also, like there's a lot of like reincarnation stuff, which normally is not really my bag, but really works here. And it's ambitious and it's big, and it makes the X-Men not feel like superheroes, but like genuinely this like kind of all new, all different, or like literally uncanny. Like they feel in that book like they are not just because the difficulty of the so-called like mutant metaphor is that the mutants have to be stand-ins for every oppressed minority. And also, they are this very particular kind of stand-in, which, not to get like super political, but of course, it is a sort of political allegory. And it's a very specifically kind of like liberal democratic political allegory, right? Like the X-Men are the mutants who want to be accepted by humanity and therefore to sort of assimilate into humanity. And the villains are usually the mutants are mutant supremacists of one sort or another.
Which is a weird way to frame it because also, like, if you look back at the early history of the X-Men, which happened in the late 60s, there was a thing called the Civil Rights Movement happening at the same time. Go figure.
Yeah.
Like, Professor X, who's all about integration of human and mutant society, was very much coded as the Martin Luther King Jr., whereas Magneto, the radical who wants to fight the humans to achieve mutant dominance, was coded as more of the Malcolm X type.
But what's the thing is, like, that's not even, I don't even think that's precisely true. I mean, because the thing is, you go back to those original like 60s and 70s, basically like everything pre-Claremont, the whole, like the X-Men really, like, because I went back and looked at this recently because I was thinking about this question. The X-Men really are not even coded as minorities early on. They're coded
as a Doom Patrol ripoff.
Yeah, or at the very least, youth. Their youth culture as created by people who did not understand the children. And when
I say a Doom Patrol ripoff, there's a DC show now for Doom Patrol, but Doom Patrol was literally a team of people who were considered freaks in the DC universe,
fighting for a world that hated and feared them, et cetera, et cetera.
And literally, the guy who led them was a dude in a wheelchair. So there's maybe some cribbing, some light cribbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm
that
being as charitable as possible.
Stan Lee was, and this is a genuinely good thing about him, as well as a sort of like genuinely bad thing about him, was he was a very light-fingered creative when it came to things that he liked. So I don't know that there's ever been any proof that the X-Men are a ripoff of the Doom Patrol. But frankly, it would not greatly shock me if Lee like saw that and was like, maybe there's something there.
And at this point, doesn't matter.
Yeah, they're very different now. But
and the other thing that people don't remember about the X-Men is that those comics the original Lee and Kirby comics were an absolute failure. Like it was Marvel's first great swing and a miss. Like after the huge success of things like the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, people think about Iron Man now as like one of the preeminent Marvel heroes. Like he was a nothing in the early days of Marvel Comics. And like the X-Men was really the first time that like a series just completely failed.
Just flopped. Yeah, it just wasn't. And there's kind of a reason for that, because those early comics are like kind of nothing. Magneto is a great character, and he became a great character under Chris Claremont.
Those early comics, there's also a lot of perving out over Jean Grey, the single female character.
Yeah,
it's not good in hindsight. Probably wasn't great then, but
no, I don't even think it wasn't great then. But I think, but to this like civil rights thing, what's really interesting is that what the mutant metaphor became was it was originally about youth outsider culture, and then later on under like subsequent creators, there started to be this like frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, once the civil rights movement was over, there started to be this stuff that got like kind of retroactively grafted onto it, where the mutant metaphor started being used as a minority metaphor, which has always been a very poor fit for, because as David Brothers, a very fine comics critic and sort of like industry guy, has pointed out,
and a buddy of mine in real life.
Oh yeah, he's a good dude. Has pointed out, black people don't shoot lasers from their eyes.
Which there's been some really interesting stories recently within the past couple of years that are exploring this idea, like, well, what if minorities literally did just have superpowers? And I can't remember any of the specific. Upstream Color, I think, was one of the movies recently that came out about this idea. And so it makes the point that you're making, I think, extremely clear if you actually explore what if people were scared of minorities because they could shoot laser beams out of their eyes, whereas people are scared of minorities even though there's nothing that's actually dangerous there. You know what I mean?
And there is actually something, the one sort of utility of the X-Men for this point is that even though it's kind of dicey to do a metaphor, I think one of the reasons, by the way, we've seen X-Men switch into more of a metaphor for like LGBTQ rights is because there is something extremely dicey about replaying the civil rights movement with a largely, though not entirely, in fairness, white cast.
But there's also something I think that's about the way that the X-Men were written as the powers usually manifest at puberty, right?
Right. Which is a great detail.
It's a great detail, but it makes it a better fit for things like gender identity, sexual orientation, because that's when all of that is happening.
Right. And so you then end up with this weird thing where Chris Claremont, who was writing X-Men comics for a while, absolutely coded characters like, Kitty Pryde and Rachel Gray, who is Cyclops and Jean's time-displaced daughter from an alternate future, because that's just scratching the surface.
And she was raised to hunt mutants. That's the important thing.
Yeah, but they are absolutely, those two characters are, Chris Claremont has said, I think in a fairly recent interview, that he wrote Rachel as the love of Kitty's life. And that was not something he could do explicitly at the point when he was writing those comics.
The Chris Claremont era of X-Men is a very sexy era in a very like teen way. It's a lot of like misty shower scenes where things are covered up just enough to get it printed.
Yeah, I mean, Claremont wrote what he liked, but he also, I think, was coming from a sort of sphere where there was an idea that like queerness should have been part of that book. And I think if you'd seen Claremont coming up and writing today, like a lot of that stuff I think would have been a good deal more overt. And it's certainly it's in the place now where it's like it's subtext, but it's subtext because it's not outright stated. Like it's definitely, the coding is there. And so one of the really interesting things about House of X and Powers of X, this new X-Men series that's
really quick before you get to
Mhm.
that, what's fascinating to me is that I think the X-Men films are batting like maybe 1 out of every 5 is okay or bordering on good.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
But like X-Men 3, X-Men Divided United, I can't remember what the dumb subtitle.
X-Men X United? No, that's X2. Yeah.
X3, The Last Stand, that's what it's called.
Yeah, that's it.
Brett Ratner, not a good director, not a good person. That movie I actually think nails the counterculture aspects of the mutants, not the X-Men, because most of it is the Magneto scenes with his crew. But like, it actually nails the counterculture aspects of things better than I think any other of the films has. Like, I'm not going to recommend that movie, but that one facet of it is a little closer to, hews a little closer to the sort of Claremontian, maybe even more closer to the Grant Morrison idea of mutants as societal outcasts, but they embrace it in a way that makes them cool.
The thing about Claremont is that Claremont didn't do very much with the idea of mutants having a distinct culture of their own. And then Grant Morrison comes in and does his run, which is, I think, a really good run in a lot of ways. It's sort of, it has some problems and also has a lot of art by a guy who is now basically a alt-right neo-Nazi, but he wasn't to know that at the time.
Yeah, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Discussion for another time when we're not recording, but...
Yeah, that dude.
Yeah.
But check out Google Osher Elbein the Daily Beast if you want the lowdown on that.
Oh, I forgot you were involved in that.
I was involved in that. I am.
Yep.
Yeah.
I did not bring that up to actually put you on the spot, but I remember now that you were a part of that story, and it's... Whoo boy! All right,
it's a lot. Yeah, link to it in the show notes. It's a good story. And
also just read that story and then walk away entirely because it is not worth your time to explore.
It will. As Mary Kondo would say, it would not spark joy.
It is not worth your time or the toll it would take on your psyche to remember that this person that we're talking about exists in the world.
Yeah. But the thing that I think Morrison got was the idea that, like, okay, if these people belong to a minority culture of kind, then they would have a distinct culture of their own. And this is something that Johnathan Hickman in this new House of X, Powers of X series has really brought back in a major way. Of the X-Men are essentially now saying, we're not human. We are people, but we're not human. And we have our own island, we have our own culture, we have our own society. And so that's also kind of playing with fire in a way, because it's inviting comparisons to, sort of like real world political experiments, like, of course, the nation of Israel or the idea of a Kurdistan.
I'll actually tell you what I don't like about it.
What do you like?
I've read all of it, and I as comics, they're very good. They're super Hickman.
They are extremely Hickman, yes.
Hickman,
a lot of charts. Fella likes his charts.
He likes charts. He likes graphic design. He likes the biggest of big ideas, to the point where you're like, "Are you just rubbing this in my face that you think I won't get this?" Which, almost to the degree I find offensive as a storyteller. As a person reading a story by a storyteller, I find it offensive in whatever, you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
The thing that rubs me a little bit the wrong way is when you make it so, Grant Morrison's book still took place at the school in upstate New York at the beginning of his run.
Right.
Hickman's run establishes this island nation state, and the island itself is also a mutant. Fun
yes.
twist. Thank you, Jason Aaron. It comes across a little culty and a little jingoistic in ways that, like, I'm still wrapping my head around. Maybe this grander arc will stick the landing, but
I'm not sure that that's not intentional.
Right. But like the way, with the resurrection stuff, like there's a lot of religious undertones.
We should talk about that, by the way, because one of the big changes is that people don't stay dead.
One of the big changes is Johnathan Hickman undid death in the entire Marvel Comics universe.
Well, specifically for mutants, and the idea being that, and this is something I genuinely 100% like, because it feels like we had gotten to this point in some of the X-Men comics I was reading and others I was kind of like paying attention to, where it was like, oh, we killed off a bunch of mutants for stakes and then they're back. And it's like, at some point, clearly death is not it's a lazy place to go if you're trying to establish dramatic stakes when it's clear that at some point that character will be back. And especially for the X-Men, who have a real, like, of all superheroes, have a real tendency to just, like, pop down to cool their heels in Hades for a little while and then, like, kind of come whistling back, like, a year later.
I mean, they literally have a character named Phoenix.
So I think there's actually something very smart about taking the option to play death as the death of a main character for big dramatic stakes off the table and say, okay, we're not doing that anymore. We've done that for the last 20 years of comic storytelling. It's old. It's played out. Like, Jean Grey has come back from the dead at least 3 or 4 times. Her name is Phoenix, so at least she has an excuse. But, like, Wolverine was, like, dead for real.
And they literally just brought a version of him from the future.
They literally just brought a version of him from the future. If you're not going to kill someone off, don't kill them off. Or I think Hickman found a really elegant way of sort of squaring that circle, which is...
Everything he does is elegant. That's the problem.
Oh, yeah. Jealousy is what I'm hearing.
A bit. I mean, it's
understandably so.
No, it's the issue that, like, Hickman knows he's the smartest guy in the room, and he plays to that, and like, I think that a lot of what he does is really interesting. I don't always know that it plays out as well as it possibly could in the story. Yeah, so my thing is, when it comes to the professional jealousy, is that Hickman knows he's the smartest guy in the room, and everyone in the room seems to be willing to acknowledge it. I've never been in that room, and that's where the jealousy comes in.
Sure. Well, so I've been reading a lot of X-Men. There's another comic I wanted to talk about, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, there's this comic called Giant Days.
I have not read Giant Days.
So what Giant Days is that Giant Days is a sort of lightly surrealistic story about 3 young women going to college in England. It's by writer John Allison, artists Lisa Tremaine on the initial miniseries, and then Max Sarin coming in and doing the rest of the book. And it is 100% full bore delightful. It is incredibly funny. It's incredibly well, really well structured, and really, like, the art is a sort of like really incredibly alive and expressive cartooning. And it's one of those books where it's like, it's very easy for people, I think, to just think about comics as like just superhero comics. And Giant Days falls into this space of being sort of slice of life comics that have just this very slight, unrealistic twist. Like, nothing overtly fantastic happens in them, except that, when you're a college student, everything's a bit surreal and everything's a bit unrealistic. And so Giant Days really kind of plays with that. It is the 3 main characters there's a pre-med nursing student who is very wry and very sarcastic and very aggressive. There's a sort of very sweet, innocent archaeology student who is dealing with sort of like working out her identity both romantically and sort of in life. And then there is a goth girl who is very friendly and also has a tremendous propensity for attracting the weirdest kinds of drama. So you just end up with these 3 wonderful personalities sort of just like bouncing off of each other and all these other people at their college. And it is the sort of thing that it may not sound like it's your thing, but if you give it like 1 or 2 issues, I almost can guarantee it will be. It is a complete triumph and one of my favorite series that like ended this year.
Okay, that's awesome. I will definitely check that out. So I've seen it. I just haven't actually picked it up.
Yeah, it's also, I think, just a really nice change of pace from I wouldn't say that I've been feeling a little burnt out on Cape Comics, but it's nice to have other types of stories.
I took a course. So I got in I was into comics as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Like a little kid. Because I liked, Superman, Spider-Man, which people, when I point out that like 2 of my favorite characters are Superman and Spider-Man, people are like, yeah, Ryan, the world's favorite characters are Superman and Spider-Man. I was going to be like, no, but like it's special to me.
Yeah, and also Superman and Spider-Man are great. Actually, okay, so quick digression, hot take for you. Spider-Man, while not in any way the same character as Superman represents a really interesting iteration on the Superman narrative engine by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. So if you think about Superman's whole thing, Superman is an outsider, kind of, but he's an outsider that everybody loves. You know, he works at he has a secret identity who's kind of like a schmuck, but
not anymore.
Not anymore, right? But
as of last week, classically,
he has this secret identity. He, you know, has this kind of like gruff boss at his journalism job, and all of his stuff is about sort of like, oh, you know, you are Superman. You have all this responsibility. You have all this power. And Spider-Man is all of that, but filtered through a very specific Marvel lens. You know, Peter Parker, like you think Clark Kent's a nobody. Peter Parker is traditionally like a nobody.
I mean, Superman never has to worry about, or Clark Kent never has to worry about paying rent on time.
Yeah, that Peter Parker's entire deal is, what if Clark Kent had to worry about paying the rent, and also like everything that could possibly go wrong in his life, and not in a superhero way, did. It's actually like kind of brilliant. And obviously, they're very different characters, but I really can't help but think of Spider-Man as this sort of like fascinating iteration on the Superman idea. And I can't help but wonder if that's not why he's as sort of popular as he is. Because like all the people who say that, I think the very obnoxious stuff about, oh, Superman's boring because he's too powerful.
Incorrect.
Yeah, factually incorrect, but people do say it. Spider-Man is sort of like taking that idea of, what if Superman's life just sort of sucked?
You're right. What if being Superman was his escape from how terrible everything else was going?
Yeah.
And that's why I think that the fact that so Superman was created in the late 30s, Spider-Man was created in the mid to late 60s, and then in the early aughts, so a little bit of it took maybe a little longer than it should have, someone like Brian Michael Bendis came along and said, well, let's do Spider-Man again, but today, and that's how you end up with someone like Miles Morales.
Yes.
Because I've heard interviews, and you know, Bendis talks about how, like, look at the person who would have the down and out, nothing ever quite goes right. Like, it's impossible to stay on top of everything, and I'm just scrambling to keep afloat life. That's not a white kid from Queens anymore. Like, it's not to say that those people don't exist, but if you're, but comics are all about plugging into a zeitgeist. And so if you're trying to plug into a zeitgeist, who is that character? Who is that archetype? It's not an Irish white kid from Queens anymore. It's an Afro-Latino kid from the Bronx or Brooklyn. And I love that he had that insight. I love that he nailed that character so well. I keep cutting you off because you keep wanting to make points because Miles Morales is great and the Spider-Verse won an Oscar. So continue.
It absolutely did win an Oscar. Yeah, well, actually, gonna chase this line of thought for a bit. One of the things that I find, I've been very bearish on a lot of the pop culture this year. And I think one of the reasons for it, as I was kind of thinking about this today, because, you know, the reviews for Rise of Skywalker came out and they're not super kind. And not having seen the movie, I can't comment. I mean, I could comment on it, but I shouldn't. I haven't seen it. But one of the things I was thinking was, I was not wowed by a lot of the MCU movies that came out this year. I found them to be fine. You know, they're fine. And then I was thinking about Spider-Verse and how transcendent that movie is in its sort of and how sort of weird and joyous and just unlike anything else I'd ever seen before it was. And looking at a lot of the other sort of like pop culture, you know, big like nerd stuff that's come out this year, I've just kind of had this feeling of like, is this it? Like, the whole thing that we were promised is sort of at the advent of like the big nerd era kicked off by, let's say it's traceable to before this, but let's say like the Marvel era of like the Avengers, when it's like, okay, this is the thing that we're doing now is, you know, like Star Wars is going to come back and it's going to have all these interesting directors, and we're going to get interesting directors from Marvel movies. It's going to be interesting directors doing cool things with the nerd stuff that you love.
Then cut to headline, Edgar Wright exits Ant-Man.
Yeah. Or, you know, slam cut to everybody loses their mind about The Last Jedi, a film which is very divisive. I really loved it. I know that obviously a lot of people didn't. But one of the things that really struck me about that film was that, like it or not, Rian Johnson took a swing about, like, Rian Johnson's an interesting director and an interesting writer, and whether or not you like what he did with it, he didn't do just like, he was not sleepwalking through that project. And a lot of what we've gotten from like big corporate media recently has been very it's, you know, I don't want to cast aspersions on any of the directors or writers who I'm sure are, you know, doing the best they can, but it's not, it doesn't really feel like what we were promised, you know? And then here comes Spider-Verse, and it is a triumph from pillar to post of just okay, so
you're getting into Spider-Verse. I gotta cut you off slightly because I have so much to say about you're getting ready to make a different point than the point you were just making, and I was I'm a bundle of nerd energy right now. Oh boy, sometimes the weather's underneath you as opposed to over the top of you. And when I'm feeling underneath the weather, I reach for a cold glass of tea. That's right. Just like last episode, I'm still drinking that same jar of Running Byrd Tea Company Thai spiced iced tea. Just a little bit sweet. I don't know. That's not their motto. I just made that up. That's probably some other tea company's motto, but that's what I'm having. Hey, it wouldn't be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't talk about what we're drinking. I've never front-loaded what I'm drinking, but I guess I've never repeated either. There's a lot of firsts happening this time. Write about your first time drinking iced tea. Send it to us on Twitter, hashtag firsttimeteatime. All right, back to my chat with Usher. Bye. I think the Russo brothers are excellent filmmakers. So, like, if we're dancing around the bush of talking about things like Endgame, I thought Endgame was as close to sticking the landing as you could possibly do, but, like, what does sticking the landing mean after 10 years of filmmaking? And, like, I also, like, I love the idea that the Russo brothers came from a show like Community, and the paintball episodes of Community are what Marvel saw and was like, oh, you can do that on this budget? You're hired.
They're very good.
So, like, I love that they're bringing that ethos to the biggest budget films of literally all time. I think that's an interesting perspective. Whether or not the film itself is also interesting is a different debate. And then something like Rian Johnson, the whole thing is like, you guys know that the original, like, and this is me speaking to the nerds who hated Last Jedi. I'm like, you guys know that the original Star Wars was a departure from every sci-fi film that had been made to that point ever. Like, you look at a sci-fi film the year before Star Wars comes out, it's terrible.
Totally different. Yeah.
You look at a sci-fi film the year after Star Wars comes out, it's Alien. So, like, not that Star Wars yielded Alien, but, like, it did change. It changed everything. And it changed everything because, like you said, George Lucas took a swing. And a huge, like, a bigger swing than Rian Johnson took, because Rian Johnson's personal financial well-being was not on the line for Last Jedi, whereas George Lucas, like, literally gave everything. Like, he used every dollar he had to make that movie.
So there's an essay pitch that and, you know, hopefully by the time this goes out, somebody will have taken this, or I'll have written it for somewhere. But I'm co-writing, or I have this essay pitch that I'm co-writing with my brother about Star Wars, which is a thing that I very much grew up with and have a lot of attachment to.
I scanned your Twitter timeline to be like, I can't remember if we talked about Star Wars the last time you were on, and I was like, is he a Star Wars guy? Because I kind of want to talk about Star Wars because, you know, Rise of Skywalker comes out tomorrow.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the thing that I've realized in thinking about Star Wars very intensely for, you know, 27 years, and also even more intensely over the last year or so, is that there is a lens through which you can look at Star Wars, which is an explicitly political lens, which is Star Wars as this sort of like shadow reflection of the 40-year decline of the American empire. And that is something that sounds like a hot take, and it's not, because if you look at those, like the very first set of Lucas interviews from around the time the New Hope came out, he's explicitly talking about the sort of the politics of the day. He's talking about Watergate. He's talking about Vietnam. He's talking about these ideas about how democracies fall. And that's not like a huge part of Star Wars, of the original trilogy, but it is, I think it's pretty clearly on his mind.
And I mean, he was touching on that in the prequels too. It was just so clunky. It was super clunky.
Yeah, it's super clunky, but like for a moment, I think we all get a little bit stuck in thinking about like the prequels as like, oh, they're just bad. I mean, they are bad. They're quite bad. But if you take them seriously,
I mean, he's literally making fun of politicians he doesn't like with the way he names the bad aliens.
Yeah,
like he's not a subtle man. He's not a subtle filmmaker. Well, I was gonna say he's not a subtle filmmaker. He might be a subtle man, but he's not a subtle filmmaker.
He's not a subtle filmmaker. So you end up getting this really interesting story if you take basically all of the Star Wars films from A New Hope to The Last Jedi. You get this really interesting cyclical story about how democracies sort of rise and stagnate and fall and have to sort of like claw those freedoms back again. And you have to start
at the bottom.
You always have to start at the bottom. And when you have to start at the bottom, you get a movie like Rogue One, which is all about the sorts of things that you have to do, which is truly like real sacrifice and real resistance often involves laying your life on the line, which is something that
it's like the people who want change, they're going to bicker among themselves about how to actually achieve that change. And that's part of the process too. Like you're helping me make these connections that I haven't made before that I think is really interesting. But like the Jedi Council were never going to reform what the Jedi were.
Yeah. And something that people moaned about in the prequels was the Jedi are kind of lame. And
so this is something I have a big issue with.
I think this is clearly Lucas's point.
I don't know that it was. I don't know if I give him that much credit. Like obviously that's a post. I think if we were to assume that it is a completely post hoc interpretation of the text, I think it's valid. That's one area where I'm not totally convinced that Lucas was doing it on purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, like it's getting any answers from him about this stuff has been beaten out of him. I don't
want the answers. Like, let the man live his life. Like, I think
he's very rich. Like, let him be.
He's very rich, but he's also given he sold his baby to Disney and then gave most of that money to educational charities. Like, I have no qualms with George Lucas as a person.
Yeah, I've got no issues with the guy.
So much of where maybe his movies haven't worked is like the original Star Wars and his relationship with his producers and his wife at the time and all these other things. Like the weird alchemy of auteur theory filmmaking led to this thing happening, and then like that all kind of fell apart for him, and he made one really great sequel and one maybe not so great sequel. And like I don't begrudge the man at all. Like I will make the argument that he belongs on the Mount Rushmore of modern filmmaking, and I don't think it's that hard an argument to make. So the points where I quibble with the interpretation of what he was trying or trying not to do with the prequels is only because I think the prequels are so flawed.
Yeah, it's sometimes a little hard to tell what is intentional and what is post facto reading. But I tend to be very generous about this in the sense that given what my understanding of the clear and stated politics of those films are, I don't think it's ridiculous to assume that Lucas was intentionally setting out to depict a Jedi Order that was, maybe not all it's cracked up to be, certainly not all that Obi-Wan presented it as when he was telling Luke about it many years later.
Well, Obi-Wan, noted liar.
Yeah, Obi-Wan, not the most truthful guy. But I think that what's really fascinating about all this is that, the original series and the prequel series are, there's, as you said, the strange alchemy of producers and screenwriters, but it's let us for clarity's sake say it's all still Lucas's vision for whatever given value that means. But when the property gets handed over to Disney, something really interesting happens, which is, and we're not going to talk about the expanded universe.
It's no longer about the secret of the wills.
Well, if it ever was.
The third trilogy was supposed to go into the microverse, Asher. You know this. Don't act like you don't know about the microverse with the wills.
Honestly, I might have been down for it. Like, I don't know that I would have been, but I might have been. I don't know. We'll never know. We'll
No,
never know
exactly.
what it would have been.
It's a crazy. I mean, it's up there with the fact that George R. R. Martin didn't get to finish the story level of like, what a weird pop culture environment to be living in, where the guy who created this thing whole cloth has to watch other people steer his vision in a way that he literally made a business deal with one of the most powerful businesses on earth not to do this to him, and they did it anyway.
Yeah. Well, so the thing about the Disney Star Wars movies that is, I think, actually really fascinating, regardless of what The Rise of Skywalker ends up being, is that there was this decision about, like, what is Star Wars going to be without Lucas? And they made, I think, the understandable, if conservative, decision to replay the hit in The Force Awakens. Like, okay, there's an empire, there's a resistance. And in doing that, they actually set up and mirror, and again, knowing intent here is very difficult, but they set up and mirror this thing where it's like, okay, so remember the New Republic that was going to be a big deal at the end of, or implicitly was going to be a big deal at the end of, Return of the Jedi?
We can't just say Jedi anymore, which is annoying, by the way.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
I was very comfortable in a world where I could just say Jedi and you knew which movie I was talking about. Now there are 2 movies with Jedi as the final word, and I have to clarify, and it's annoying. Yeah,
so at the end of Return of the Jedi, you've got this implicit happy ending, which is, the Republic is back, and like this aberration, which is the Empire has fallen, and then smash cut to 30 years later, and the people who won the war, were not able to establish a new form of government that really worked. Things are just about as bad as ever. And for whatever reason, they were, the kind of the rot that Palpatine symbolized came back in the form of, the sort of not just like Nazis, but neo-Nazis. And
that's actually the thing that frustrates me, because the J.J. Abrams movie, the Force Awakens, the first one, is playing the hits, as you said, like it is a very beat for beat. To me, I always said it's a palate cleanser. It's basically like Disney and J.J. Abrams assuring us the rabid and mostly unreasonable fan base, and I'm speaking of myself and all the people I disagree with as saying we're unreasonable.
Mostly unreasonable, he says. I would say wholly unreasonable.
We cannot be. There's nothing you could do right by us. We'll find a way to be upset with you, because that Force Awakens movie hews so closely to New Hope. New Hope is the most straightforward of the movies. It's the most Campbellian, like, here's your protagonist, here's what he goes through, here are the side characters. The plot is incredibly simple. Like, guy decides to leave home, rescues the princess, decides to take down the larger threat, does so, succeeds, end of movie. So because of that, if you're going to do that same thing with Force Awakens, there's no time to get into the politics of it. And so, like, you said that, you were talking about sort of the failures of the New Republic, but, like, The Force Awakens doesn't actually give us a lot of insight into whether or not the New Republic was working. It just shows us that neo-Nazis are still effective at bringing it down.
Right. And this actually, so this is one of those things where obviously there's some like paratextual stuff in Expanded Universe that I don't know too terribly much about. Not because I'm like, oh, I'm too good to read those books, but
like we don't see the New Republic functioning in Force Awakens. All we see is it's being destroyed because.
But there is a sort of implicit thing there, though, which is just speaking completely narratively. Like,
sure.
Do the politics of that movie make sense in the sense of like what the political situation in the galaxy is? They absolutely do not. Like,
no, that's the biggest complaint my wife has about that movie is that, like, why on any system in the galaxy, well, I don't know why I'm referring to Earth, why on Alderaan does a New Republic sanctioned force led by General Leia Organa call itself the Resistance? Like, what?
Yeah, well, so there are like, I 100% agree with you. Like, there are real sort of like world building problems here.
That's her point. Credit where credit's due.
Okay, I agree with her. Yeah. But I think that what they sort of stumbled into with that is, especially with what they did with, Ben Solo, Kylo Ren, about this idea of the dark side being, not just sort of like explicitly equated with fascism as it is across all of the movies in sort of like coding.
What?
But also, obviously, right? But it's not, you get to this point where it's like, okay, the whole idea of, okay, we're going to fix the world and then the world's going to stay fixed, but it doesn't, like, the skills it takes to overthrow an empire are not the skills that it necessarily takes to, build a new society. Luke Skywalker is a great warrior, but that doesn't mean he's a good teacher. And the sort of like chosen child of Han and Leia becomes the sort of like narrative equivalent of a school shooter, or is at least presented as such in the first two movies. And so you end up with this like really kind of, I think, really powerful narrative arc where you start out with the Old Republic, which is this, vast liberal democracy that is ossifying and the norms are failing and is eaten alive from the inside by authoritarianism. And that authoritarianism is overthrown.
Because, Palpatine was elected.
Yeah.
Like, fairly elected, like, by the rules
Fair
that
and square.
existed.
He absolutely was. I'm sure that people thought the norms would contain him too. And you want an empire? That's how you get an empire. But yeah, I think, and then you end up with this place where it's like, well, suddenly we're back to where we started, that nothing stays fixed. And because nothing stays fixed, everyone has to fight all the time against the dark side, which is why Star Wars is really about how if you see a Nazi, punch a Nazi.
And it's also about how, like, if there is such a thing as the Force, this is the pivot point where our discussion may fall apart completely based on tomorrow.
Right.
Is the Force about whether or not you need to be a Skywalker or whether or not you're a kid with a broom?
Right.
Because that's a huge part of it, right? Is it about the legacy of a special family, or is it about this small part of greatness that could be any one of us, and he gives us the power to do what we need to do in the world?
And I will say, again, not having seen the film, if it turns out that The Rise of Skywalker is indeed just J.J. Abrams playing the hits in a desperate attempt to capitulate a wholly unreasonable fan base by steering away from everything that made The Last Jedi interesting, that will at the very least be a poetic end to, as I said, a saga that mirrors the sort of like collapse of the American empire over 40 years, when there was an option for a bold way forward and instead retreated to the hollow glories of the past.
Which, it gets us back to our Superman discussion, because it's like, was Luke always meant to be the Superman because of who his dad was, or was he the Superman because he was raised by this farm couple and taught values that resonate and matter, and he brings those with him to the fight? Yeah,
I don't know, man. I don't know. I think that
I love, like, Luke. I would say Luke Skywalker is legitimately, like, he's up there with Superman for me in my pantheon of literary, cinematic, comic, whatever heroes. Like, he's
sure
that level.
Do you? So I will say I really like what The Last Jedi does with him. It wasn't what I was expecting, but I really like it. How do you feel about it?
So much of Last Jedi for me is I have such a hard time with. I really like the film.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of where I struggle with Last Jedi is I really wish, and this is not fair just because of how the universe works. I wish Carrie Fisher hadn't died for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And if Rian Johnson knew that he had to wrap up her story, because what it seems to me is that, like, Force Awakens was clearly written to be, okay, here's how Han Solo's story ends. Yeah. And Last Jedi was clearly written to be, like, here's how Luke Skywalker's story ends. And so I was anticipating that, like, the third movie, before we even knew what the title was going to be, was here's how Princess Leia, General Leia Organa's story ends. And the fact that clearly can't happen now just because of how the world works throws everything out of perspective for me.
Yeah.
And, like, I remember sitting in the theater watching Last Jedi, and the bridge explodes and all of them get flung out into space. And I remember, like, tearing up, just being like, Rian Johnson, I really like you as a filmmaker. Please don't make me watch Princess Leia die. And then she does, everybody calls it the Mary Poppins thing, where she, like, floats back into the bridge or into the other ship. And I'm just like, I don't know that was a good story choice, but, like, I also couldn't handle anything else at the moment. Like, I was so raw from it.
I think it's a good story choice.
Okay, that's fair. I'm so conflicted because of everything else I'm feeling in that moment, where I can't disentangle my emotions with my ability to, like, determine story choices. And so much of my feeling about Last Jedi, like, which again, I think is a really good film, and I really, really enjoyed it. But I just wish that life didn't happen the way that it happened, and that we could have kept that clarity there. That all being said, that's a huge, probably unnecessary caveat. I loved Luke in that movie. I loved his brief interaction with Yoda. I think, Yoda saying, like, we are what they outgrow, to paraphrase it, is one of the most powerful lessons.
Failure is the most important lesson.
In the Jedi canon. And, just watching, man, I do love just watching Mark Hamill chew the scenery.
Oh, yeah. Oh, he's great. He's great in that movie.
And his fight with Kylo, where, Rian Johnson is a clever filmmaker. He puts every clue you need right there in your front of your face. And I the first time I saw the movie, I missed every single one of them. The only one I got was that, like, I'm pretty sure, like, did Luke dye his hair before coming to the planet with the salt? Like, that was literally the only one of all the clues. The only one I caught was, like, his hair and beard aren't quite the right color. So I thought they crushed it. I thought that ending for Luke is just about as perfect an ending as Luke could have hoped for. And it was really interesting to see Luke as a tragic character. Like you said, like, the greatest warriors don't always make the best teachers. I think that sums it up really well for me.
I think that it is, I think the fundamental conflict of Star Wars narratives, especially now under Disney, is, and really like a conflict that has always been there since A New Hope or just Star Wars at the time came out and blew everybody away, is, are these movies about something? Or is this an excuse to smash action figures together, which could have been satisfied if George Lucas had just gotten the rights to Flash Gordon like he originally wanted? And I think that I love Star Wars most when the movies are genuinely about something, as well as being a truly fun and sort of weird world to just luxuriate in. And my fear is that Star Wars going forward is going to be action figures. And I wish nothing but the best to the people who really enjoy that, but I don't. And
I'm with you.
I guess I'm hoping for more. And if it's not, then I will have to break up with Star Wars and get on with my life, which would be a terrible thing to contemplate. But, there it is.
Like, I enjoy every episode of The Mandalorian, but the thing that, and I haven't watched today's episode, again, just to timestamp when you and I are talking.
Sure.
I really like The Mandalorian from a design perspective, from a casting perspective, from a music perspective. Because the weird thing is, the guy who does the music for Mandalorian, Ludwig Göransson, did all the music for Community.
What, really?
Yeah, it all connects. It's all back to Community. It's the weirdest thing. Dan Harmon was talking in an interview about how he had to fill out part of Ludwig Göransson's visa application because he got into the country on a genius grant.
Wow.
My buddy Jesse and I were talking about this. Like, he's literally a genius at making TV and film music. And I think The Mandalorian exemplifies that entirely, as does the Community. I thought the music on Community was great.
Yeah.
So, like, Dan Harmon gave us the Russo brothers and Ludwig Göransson and rewrites on Doctor Strange, which was a very mediocre movie. But to me, The Mandalorian is, like, what a beautiful, well-casted, interesting show that seems to have an allergic reaction to having a point.
Yeah, that's what I would say. It's like The Mandalorian is the embodiment of a certain vision of Star Wars, which is, if I were feeling deeply uncharitable, I would say is the expanded universe problem of this should exist because Star Wars is good and anything Star Wars is good, and it doesn't need to mean anything or say anything or tell you anything. Look, it's a Mandalorian. You like the Mandalorians, don't you? Oh, hey, there are Jawas on this planet. You like the Jawas? And it's just like,
what is the point of seeing Boba Fett for 90 seconds in Empire Strikes Back if we don't know what metal his breastplate is made out of?
Yeah, man. And it's like, I
don't care. Like, I really yeah.
Yeah, I don't. And this is the most damning thing I can say about The Mandalorian. It's not that it's bad, because it's not. I don't care. I don't care.
I care. I just wish it had a point. Like, what is the point you're making? Like, you're telling a story. You're telling it's a Western. I get that. Like, I get that the legacy of the Western is about characters who maybe don't have an agenda or don't have an agenda that is easily understood or agreeable or whatever. But like that doesn't get you off the hook from you still have to be saying something. And if you're not saying anything, then like, why am I watching? And this is a show I really like.
I think this is the danger of Star Wars being iconography rather than story, is that whatever else you can say about the prequels, and by God, there is a lot to say. Lucas had some stuff that he was working out and some stuff he was trying to say. During the prequels. They're not good. I'm not defending them in the sense of like as like secret genius or anything.
People do though.
But what I would say is that give me the prequels over the Mandalorian any day, because the prequels are trying. And The Mandalorian strikes me as a show that is perfectly content to coast on the fact that it is Star Wars. And if that's what Star Wars is going to be from now on, sign me out, man. I'm not into it.
I don't know that I'm totally there with you yet, but I see your point, and I think that it's not invalid to use my, scientists love using double negatives, as I'm sure you've been speaking with us over the years.
Certainly
gets us out of a lot of having to have a point, which is the thing I just accused the Mandalorian of. So maybe that's why I'm sympathetic to it.
We're none of us without sin.
Well, now you just sound like a Cinema Sins video, and I can't abide by that either. So, which I actually don't hate Cinema Sins. I also just think it's pointless.
No disagreement there.
Let me try to tie everything together. I'm gonna try. And if I get it wrong, say that I got it wrong, but I think I've got an interesting perspective here.
Okay, hit me.
We live during peak nerd culture, and a lot of it's bad, especially the behavior of the nerds, of which you and I probably consider ourselves members of the ranks.
Yeah.
In terms of a novel ecosystem, did we need the predators of jocks to keep us down this whole time?
Man, maybe. I don't know.
Like, were jocks fulfilling an important role in the ecosystem to cull our numbers from time to time so that we didn't get too powerful and become absolute insufferable jerks?
Well, I think the secret, frankly, is that nerds were always insufferable jerks. It's just
the secret is we were always angry.
Yeah.
Just like the Hulk.
Yeah, I think if I'm trying to think of a way to put this. I think that if there's one thing that the last decade has proven, is that the entire narrative that a lot of nerd culture has been predicated on, which is that because nerds like things that other people don't like, and they like them just so much, and nobody understands us, and if people only understood us, they would like us. It really reminds me of the one good line in the film, The Social Network, which is that bit where Mark Zuckerberg is talking to a girl, and the girl says, "You're not gonna," I forget what it is, girls don't like you, and you think it's because you're a nerd. And I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart, it's not true. It's because you're an asshole. And that quote, I think, embodies like the dominance of nerd culture in America today, is that, I'm not saying that, nerds of an earlier era were not treated very badly for being outside of mainstream culture. Mainstream culture is not kind to people on the counterculture, but just because you are treated badly does not make you inherently better than the people who treat you badly. And a lot of people were really just clearly looking for their chance to treat other people badly. And that's not what Superman or Luke Skywalker would have wanted, you bastards.
No, it's literally like, because you were bullied, now you have the chance to be a bully, and like, hooray, I get to be a bully now. And I'm like, no, that was never the lesson. That was never it was never what any of this media was trying to tell you to do.
Yeah. You say you love this stuff, but gee, I don't know.
Revenge of the Nerds includes a literal rape scene where the hero nerd wears a Darth Vader, he's the villain, by the way, mask and rapes a person. Like, it's not like that was by the nerds for the nerds. Like, it's been problematic for a long time, and
yeah,
I'm glad we're grappling with it. I wish that it was easier. I wish that there were better avenues for these sorts of discussions, because it's reached a point where, like, I have a hard time identifying publicly as a Star Wars fan.
Yeah.
Because they're such jerks.
Yeah, it's like here's what I'd say about Star Wars. I take Star Wars seriously. I do not take it literally, and I have very little patience for people who take it literally.
I live in DC. I can't use that kind of language.
Yeah, I know, but
there's a certain commander in chief who may or may not.
Yeah, I stole it from that, but like I do think that there's actually some utility in that framing, in the sense of, is Star Wars about the story, or is it about knowing the precise specifics of how the Force is supposed to work?
Right. Anyone who worries about whether or not you could write a Wikipedia article based on the information given in a film.
I will be diplomatic and say there are two different approaches to interacting with narrative, and I know which one that I prefer.
That is very diplomatic. With that, we should talk about, what you've got going on in the world, where people can connect with you. If 2 hours of you and I chatting about everything on our minds wasn't enough, where can people go for more?
Certainly. So you can find me on Twitter at Osher_Elbein. That is, or at my website, OsherElbein.com. And I have, of course, the book Ghost Days, which is a collection of Appalachian short historical fiction / sort of horror fiction, folklore, fantasy. There's a witch. She wanders around having adventures. There's also a brand spanking new novella starring the main character of Ghost Days, Anna O'Brien, called In the Snow, the Jungle, that is available for pay what you want as long as it's over $3 on Gumroad. That's about, I would say, 14,000 words of fresh content with beautiful Tiffany Terrell illustrations. I'm very proud of it. Hopefully people will like it. And that's available in ebook form. So if you've liked hearing from me, feel free to go check that out. And finally, I have a Patreon, and you can, if you back me on Patreon, I offer sort of exclusive journalism, exclusive interviews, deleted scenes from articles, sort of interesting things I've read, roundups, original fiction, that sort of thing. And, anything you can give helps me pay these gimmicks they keep sending in the mail called bills.
And like food.
And food, yeah. I'm drawing in enough on Patreon to help pay the grocery money, and that's good because I like eating.
Right. I mean, you're not going to eat those wild hogs, but like you still got to eat.
Yeah. Only freelancers who aren't Jewish can eat the wild hogs. The Jewish freelancers have to make do until cowboys get really cool about cattle rustling.
What if the hogs evolved a hoof that wasn't cloven anymore, though?
That is a fascinating question that I advise you to take up with your local rabbi.
I will. I have a rabbi I consult on these issues. I'm actually not kidding. I do, and I will, and thank you for the advice, and we'll go from there. Osher, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, it was a blast. I'd love to come back on.
We made a plan to talk for 1 hour. It has been 2 hours. This might be 2 episodes. I think this will be 2 episodes.
Cool. I'm down.
And we talked about 50% of the things we discussed talking about. So like the odds of you coming back, it was almost exactly a year ago that you were on last time. It was last November. I don't know if you looked into that. And so we may have to increase the frequency because the density of topics worth talking about is there. And so we didn't even talk about cryptids. This whole conversation.
Oh no, we didn't even talk about cryptids. All right, well, we'll have to do a cryptid episode at some point.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out how to tie in the origins of same-sex relationships with cryptids and burbs. I guess burbs could maybe be a type of cryptid.
In a sense.
Well, I hope you're well. Go check all the links to everything you will need to get in touch with Osher on the show notes for this episode at sciencesword.com. And yeah, Osher, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Take it easy. Plink plonk.
Thanks again to Asha for giving us so much of his time. We really, really appreciate it. Couldn't make the show unless I had someone to talk to, even though these segments seem to be challenging that somewhat since I'm talking to no one. I guess I'm talking to you, the listener. Thanks, listener, for listening. I guess my dog can probably hear me. She's around here somewhere. In her never-ending quest to destroy all squirrels. Someday, Clementine, you'll get those squirrels. The feedback segment of the show is where we talk about feedback from the listeners. I talked last episode about sort of some new iTunes reviews that had me feeling good, feeling the warm and fuzzies, and I want to feature another one. This one from Crue Taylor. Crue spelled C-R-U-E, which is a word I see referring to like vintages of wines and beers. I don't really know what it means, but that's the context. This is not the crew context of rowing a boat, nor the people you go around with. It's some other kind of crew. The title of the review is, I'm science sort of obsessed with the show. 5 stars. I've always loved science, and I love to learn. I currently am not in the position to pursue any college at the moment, but I still want to learn scientific stuff. If you're in my position, this show is perfect for you. I can't stress how much I've learned. There are hundreds of different topics that they talk about on this show, and they also explain it so regular wannabe scientists like me can understand the topics without having extensive knowledge of the article or topic. Give it a listen. You won't regret it. Well, Crew, that's a great review. I really like it when people highlight both a little bit of their lived-in experience and then what about the show makes it important for them and where they think that overlap for what works for them about the show makes it a good listen for other people. Basically a perfect review. I think that accomplishes everything a review ought to accomplish, including making me feel good. So thanks, Crew. Really helps out a lot. And it helps people find the show on iTunes. If you want to support the show, you can leave us an iTunes review, and that would be super helpful. You can also check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/science-sort-of. We've already recorded the next couple of episodes. We're just working on getting those edited, and apologies for the delay in between episodes. I am pursuing some new avenues for getting the show edited. Neither myself nor Tim Dobbs have the time that we would like to dedicate to getting the show out as quickly as possible. So he and I are working together to arrange some other help there. So that should hopefully help smooth out some of the bumps in the road of getting the show produced. And those efforts wouldn't be possible if we didn't have the support of our listeners, especially those folks who donate to us on Patreon. So if you want to hear a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes, patreon.com/science-sort-of. Signing up at any level will get you access to sort of the extra communiques that I send out on that channel. And with that, thank you so much for checking out this episode. Next episode is going to be a lot of fun as well. So stay tuned for that soon. And be sure to come back for a whole lot more science.
Sort of?
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Oh, wow, Asher, I didn't have to prompt you that time. That was great. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sitting around for another half hour in silence just to let me do all these parts. That was excellent. Clam.